Hey everyone, National Master Steven Adams here, and today I want to talk to you about a maneuver in chess I call the Rook Pawn Run. This is exactly what it sounds like. We run the Rook Pawn up the board with the intent of creating a weakness in our opponent's camp. So I have this saying that goes like this: if you don't know what to do, Rook Pawn Run. And what we mean by this is if you don't know what to do and there's nothing urgent going on, it's always helpful to keep the Rook Pawn Run as a potential plan in the back of your mind. The Rook Pawn Run is a slower plan with positional aspirations, so there's nothing urgent. It could be a good option in this position. So let's have a look at this particular position. This was from a Lee Chess Rapid game of mine, and what we notice here is that we have an even material position with one open file. My king is optimally placed on f6, defending my center pawns. My bishop's well placed on e6 in the center and hitting the c4 pawn, and my knight is nicely placed on c6, where it can potentially jump to another square and it helps control the center. I can't move my d8 rook without giving up control of the d file, and moving this a8 rook's not going to really accomplish anything. I have good control of the center, but if I push the center pawn, like let's say e4, then what's going to happen is I'm going to create a massive weakness on the f4 square, so that would actually do more to hurt me than help me. I have this nice pawn duo here controlling this block of squares. I'd like to leave it that way. So what else is there to do then if all your pieces are optimally placed like this? Well, let's look at the Rook Pawn Run. Let's look at a5. Now, what does this do for our position if we can play a4 and a3? Well, this is going to force black to make a choice, or white to make a choice, I mean. So we have something like rook takes d8, rook takes d8, my opponent goes rook d1, and I move back to a8 to support the rook pawn, and now my opponent plays king to d2. And now, after the move a4, we're continuing to push. My opponent has to decide how they want to weaken their queen side now. So, if they play the move a3, well, what's going to happen now is that this c4 pawn is going to be left weakened because these two pawns are deep frozen. White's not going to be able to play b3 to support it. So, we're going to have e4, knight g1, and knight e5, and suddenly we can see that the c4 pawn is in a lot of trouble. Again, it's very difficult to support it with the b3 with the b pawn. That's just simply not happening. And if they go king c3, well, suddenly we're going rook a6, and we're using that weakened b3 square against them again. We're simply bringing rook to b6 into b3, and black just has a lot of play here. I think the c4 pawn will probably, it's just going to inevitably die. There's just no way white can keep defending it. So my opponent doesn't weaken the b3 square like that. They don't play a3 to stop it, but after king c3, we play a3. And this is very interesting now because after they play b3 and they push past, again, if they simply take it, then we're recapturing, and we have these split pawns on c4 and a2. So we have two weaknesses that we can attack, and this is very difficult for white to defend. But if they play b3, well, suddenly they have this weak a2 pawn. We have knight to b4, which is what I played, and they're going to be tied down to this a2 pawn for the rest of the game. And note they can't defend it with a king. They can't defend it with a minor piece. They're going to have to put their rook on a1. And so right now we have a knight tying down a rook, which is very nice. This is very good for us. And we see now with white's pieces tied down, and with this rook tied down to a1, what I decided to do next was attempt to open it up on the other side of the board. So I played the move pawn to f4. And my opponent went knight to e1 here because they can't afford to open it up. Like, let's say if they play something like, if they just take the pawn twice, they can win a pawn temporarily. But after bishop to g4, this pin is just a lot of trouble. They're going to be running into big problems with their king safety, actually. After, even if they try to get out of it with knight to g1 breaking the pin, we trade and go rook to d1, and suddenly they're in this mating net. Rook to d3 is coming up next. So this is absolutely unplayable for white. So they can't afford to open up the position after f4, so my opponent played the move knight to e1 here, and then after bishop f5, they did take on f4, and I took back. And here they tried to exchange pieces with bishop to d3, and after rook to e8, they were able to trade all the minor pieces, but after this, I was able to play the move f3, and we see how the weakness of the a2 pawn still persists. Even though they were able to trade off this knight on b4, they were able to get rid of my knight, we still see that this rook can come into e2 and still attack their weak pawn. So now my opponent played the move rook to d1, intending to meet rook to e2 with rook d2, but instead of going for that route, I played king g4, and we're simply going to march the king in, and we're going to take their remaining pawns. My opponent goes h4, king h3, rook d2, rook d8 check, and this is just going to simply force a rook trade into a winning king and pawn endgame, and h5. And white is going to be out of reserve tempi. Let's say king e3, we go king g2, and there's just nothing they can do. They can maybe try to make a passed pawn with g4, but we take it, h5, we go g3, and we're more than winning this. So, what we can take away from this is if we're in a slower position, like we are at the very start here, we have all of our pieces optimally placed. We don't want to move the pieces, right? If our pieces are well placed, this king is well placed, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to touch this bishop. I don't want to touch this knight. So if you're in a spot where you have all your pieces nicely placed, you don't want to touch any of them, but you're looking for ways to improve your position, one plan that you can always keep in your mind, even though it's a slower developing plan, again, if you don't know what to do, a lot of times the rook pawn run is a great option to try to create additional weaknesses in the opponent's camp. So that's all for this one. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time. Bye.